Okay, it is 7:46 at night on a Wednesday night. And I am answering student questions. That's the kind of guy I am. Okay, so I got an email. I'm just going to run through this email. There were a lot of questions. So I feel like I should just do it with you together. Thank you for the quick reply. I would like to address a few things. So this student is going to give a speech about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. They had some questions about GMOs. Yep. Yep, this is true. She feels like many of her peers are not very educated about genetic modification. That's true. I think it's something more like making Jurassic Park. Could be. Frankenstein's monster. Okay. Interesting. Okay, let's go to the questions. Okay, questions. Is genetic modification important to your own work and research? Let me answer in red. No, blue. Dark blue. Yes. Genetic modification is very important to my research. Genetic modification of organisms is literally just a tool in the lab that I use every day to dissect the systems that I'm working on. I use it every day. The issue is that, like, there's different levels of genetic modification of organisms, and some are just completely routine. We do them all the time. So, like, working with E. coli in the lab, I mean, everybody every day in a lab is making genetically modified E. coli. Everybody every day in a lab is making genetic modifications of yeast. Everybody every day is making genetic modifications of Drosophila. So I work with those main model systems, E. coli, Drosophila, yeast. Very, very common to make genetic modifications of those. Nobody cares at all. It's more of an issue when, like, you are dealing with things that affect people, like mosquitoes. If you do genetic modification of mosquitoes, which are a vector of diseases, right? Like, people care about that a lot and worry about that because, rightly so, like, if those mosquitoes get out, they can have an impact on human health. Whereas if you're, like, working with model E. coli, model yeast, model Drosophila, like, it's not going to have an impact on anything. So the answer in long sum, the answer to this question is genetic modification important to your own research? Yes, it is. But most of what I work on would be considered extremely non-controversial. Like, nothing that I do is really controversial at this point, although I had some proposals for some controversial stuff, I guess. Does genetic modification have a greater potential to benefit people or harm people? I feel like that's like saying, like, I feel like that's like the gun question, right? Like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Or, like, people don't kill people, guns kill people. Like, I feel like that's like the issue. Like, does genetic modification have greater potential to benefit? Like, I mean, it depends. Like, it's got the potential for both. It has the potential for both great harm and great benefit. And it entirely depends upon the safety and the precautions and the carefulness of researchers, and hopefully they're making responsible decisions. But for sure, I mean, it has potential to harm people. And you could think of genetic modification of viruses and the controversy with COVID, which we won't go into now, but there are some scientists who think that the COVID-19 virus was being studied in a lab and was perhaps accidentally let out on accident of the lab. So, like, I'm not going to use that as an example, but for sure, like there's potential for both great harm and great benefit. And we wouldn't necessarily know beforehand which one it was going to be. So I think it's rightly so for people to be a little cautious and a little skeptical. What are the biggest problems with genetic modification? Let me just quick off the top of my head, off-target effects. So off-target effects would be like you try to do one thing and it affects 10 other things or one other thing that you weren't thinking. So like you try to use a nuclease, a Cas9 nuclease to modify a particular gene, but accidentally you modify a different gene. That's an off-target effect. We worry about off-target effects. We worry about containment. I'm in the middle of a lecture. What's up? I don't need hand sanitizer. I'm in the garage. Thanks. Have a good night. We worry about containment. So if, for example, you are dealing with genetically modified mosquitoes, we worry about those things getting out. So multiple levels of containment are important. Often testing things on islands like Jurassic Park. That's actually like a really good idea because like the premise of Jurassic Park is it goes out of control, but it's maintained on the island. So it's not a big deal actually in the end. Problems. This is not something that like a GMO crazy person would worry about, but like actually one of the biggest problems is essentially like optimizing the system, getting it to work really reliably. So I'll say building reliable, robust tools that do what you want them to do every time, consistently, precisely. That's hard to do. That's one of the problems with genetic modification. Getting it to work cleanly. What are other things, the biggest problems? Public perception is a vastly difficult problem to solve, which I think is you're doing a good job now. You're trying to figure out how to deal with this right now by kind of presenting a little bit on this talk. Public perception of genetic modification of organisms. A lot of people just don't really understand it. And again, it's like the chemical thing, like, oh, people don't like the chemicals, even though they don't really understand what the chemicals are. So public perception is something that has to be taken seriously, and you have to go slow and do your best to get community approval where you're going to use these genetically modified organisms. You need community approval because it's not fair for some scientist who lives in the United States to make some genetically modified organism and not release it in his own backyard, but instead release it in some third world country. That's not appropriate. We can't do that. So you need public perception. You need public community approval. That's a big problem. Biggest problems with genetic modification. Like I could go on and on and on and on and on. One problem from sort of the innovator standpoint is it's not necessarily a problem. I guess it's a good thing, but constant upgrading, like constant like changes. So like if you could spend your PhD 5 years researching something that you think is going to be extremely valuable, and you'll spend 5 years of your life researching this, you put it out, and then immediately a year after somebody will put out a better system. And it's just constant replacement. And again, that's not bad. That's not a bad thing. Overall, it's a good thing. It's a systemically good thing. But from the perspective of the researcher, that could be a problem where oftentimes you have to be very careful what you invest your time into. And sometimes investment is just not worth the effort. if it's going to immediately be overturned by the next best thing. So I guess I would call this like the next best thing scenario. This is also kind of like, this relates to like the Lindy principle by Nassim Taleb, where is a concept like if something has been around and useful for 5 years, it's likely to be useful for another 5 years. If something has been around and useful for 50 years, it's likely to be around and useful for another 50 years. So like things that persist and are robust tend to continue to be robust and continue to grow in their robustness. But things that are immediately like, things that are new, most things that are new are literally like trash, and they get upgraded and overpassed. So that's a risk, is the constant upgrading from the researcher's perspective. What are the biggest problems with genetic modification? I'm thinking, is there anything else? Getting government approval can be super difficult. Like, here's what people don't understand. Imagine going up to Guy on the street and saying, how do you get EPA approval to release a genetically modified insect? What is that guy or person on the street going to say? They're going to be like, I have no idea how to do that. Researchers are that person on the street. Like, people think researchers are like somehow like different from the average human being, but like that's literally like the scenario that like I would have to deal with. Like, how would you even approach that? Who would you even call? Like, how would you even approach starting to get approval to release something that you built? So getting government approval, and like that would take a lot of money. I'm sure you would have to do some kind of test. I don't even know who you would contact. Like, you'd have to, I'm sure you'd kind of start with like, you'd like Google the EPA website, I'm sure, or the FDA website, and you'd start there, but like it's a mountain of bureaucracy. So I guess that would be another way to phrase it, is mountains of, I always spell this word wrong, bureaucracy. There we go, spell check fixed it. Mountains of bureaucracy is a problem of genetic modifications. And the other problem is the lawmakers, think about your lawmakers. Think about their education. So like your senators, your representatives, when did they get their degree? They got their degree 40, 50 years ago. Some of these people are 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, okay? And most of them know nothing about biology. They're all lawyers. And so it's like the lawmakers have no idea how to like properly regulate or even understand regulation of genetically modified organisms. So the lawmakers aren't qualified to make appropriate laws. And that means like the system that we have to go through is a horrible system that nobody knows how to navigate, and it doesn't make any sense. There's a lot. I could keep going. I could keep brainstorming. I'm going to go to the next question. Are there any safeguards in place to make sure genetic modification isn't ethically misused and that GMOs are safe? I'm working. I'm literally recording a video right now. A student asked me about genetically modified organisms. No. Thank you. You can bring me a glass of whiskey. Are there any safeguards in place to make sure genetic modification isn't ethically misused? After I just gave that answer about stupid lawmakers. The answer is yes, but it doesn't always make sense. So the answer is yes. Organizations like the EPA, the FDA, these organizations, they do have rules about GMO organisms. You can't just make shit and release it. And they're going to regulate anything that you're proposing to release. My issue is, again, the people who make these laws and write these regulations don't know what they're talking about. And the rules don't catch up fast enough. And sometimes they make no sense. The other thing is like, so here's the deal with this question is like, it almost assumes like that, like we in America are the only ones that exist. When in reality, like it doesn't really matter if America has good safeguards. Like it doesn't really matter because there's going to be other countries that just do whatever they want to do because they don't follow the regulations that America sets or the regulations that we think are best. Everybody has their own culture. Everybody has their own views. And what you're talking about is philosophy. It's not science. So there's no, like when you're talking about ethics, like countries do not agree on the same ethical principles. And so like the idea that China and Russia and America and the UK and the European Union and like New Zealand are all going to agree on the same rules is never going to happen. So there's no consistency. And that's because all people and cultures are different. So are there any safeguards? I mean, in a sense, in some regions, not in others. I mean, it comes down to risk profiles. Different cultures take different types of risks. I think what you want to get to is you want to minimize the risks that people are taking in all cases, and you want to do things very slow. And I talk about that in the GMO heuristics lecture that I give. Watch that lecture. You want to go slow. You want to test things small on islands. You want to minimize the risks. But these are just heuristics. You can't start talking about morality in science. I mean, some people think you can. I'm not a person who thinks that you can. You can't. There's no right and wrong. Like, that's what I think. We should ultimately be careful because we don't want to extinct our species and we don't want to create a situation where there's no tomorrow. So you want to follow good heuristics, but we can't force other people to follow those. How accurate is CRISPR genetic modification? This is talking about the off-target effects. How accurate is CRISPR? Yes, it depends on the system. It depends on what organism you're doing it in. It depends on what enzyme, what Cas9 you're using. They build different types of Cas9s. Like there's split Cas9s. They do modifications to the Cas9s. There's all kinds of variants, and it depends on what you're using. It's system specific. So specificity, or what we could say as like accuracy, is system specific. And sometimes we probably don't even know. Like they're working on that now. Like we're working to understand how accurate these systems are. How much damage could an unwanted mutation cause? Well, imagine a scenario where you're trying to make a mosquito that inhibits an RNA virus, and you accidentally make a mosquito that enhances an RNA virus, and now Zika or dengue is spreading in your local community. Like you could cause massive damage. It's something to take seriously for sure. I need a beer. Okay. Do you believe that genetic modification is necessary to keep people healthy and fed in nature or in the future? Or could other methods be used? Genetic modification is not necessary. And I've talked about this before. I always feel like I'm repeating myself, but there's a story here that's really relevant, which is from the book Aerosmith, which is about this medical doctor who's a researcher, and he likes this professor who's a microbiologist. And he's doing research in the microbiologist lab. And his researcher's goal is he wants to like cure this certain disease. And Professor Gottlieb says, like, why would you ever want to do that? Why would you want to completely cure all the diseases on the planet? Why would you want to make the world a perfect place? Because you know what's going to happen? Our immune systems would completely collapse. We would not be used to fighting off disease, and we would essentially go extinct from the next virus that arose. So I talk about this specifically, the lecture that I talk about this in is the heuristics lecture again, the GMO heuristics lecture. And this is the premise of, like, you never want to make things perfect. You always want to leave, how do I say it? You always want to leave stress in the system. You always want like a little stress. And that's because stress builds robustness. It helps selection keep things strong. It helps actually keep things from breaking permanently in the long run. So the idea that like genetic modification is this like golden thing that's going to solve like all the world's problems, and that it's going to cure the world and make the world a utopia and make everyone happy and feed everybody, and there'll be no starving people, there'll be no sick people, like that's never going to happen. And we would not ever want that to happen. We would never want that to happen, because we would literally like make our species decrepit. And then eventually a real stress, a real virus would come and we would become extinct. So you never want to rid the stress from the system. You want to ease it in certain situations, and you want to help people for sure. And genetic modification is a tool to help people, but it's not going to be a thing that solves all our problems. And it's not going to be the thing that leads us to like a utopia. We're not just going to be like all happy. Probably be more unhappy. I mean, if you actually look at like, there are whole books written on, I don't know if this is true or not, but there are whole books. One of the books is Civilized to Death. There are whole books written on the idea that like, we're not making our lives any better by science. Like, we're actually making our lives a living hell. All this technology, all the like internet stuff, all the constant emails. Now people are talking about like Neuralink, like linking people's brains to like the system where like Twitter could now direct feed into our brain. That's not going to make our lives any happier. It's probably going to make our lives a living hell. So genetic modification is the kind of the same thing. It's like, it's a great tool to be used cautiously, and to be used under certain circumstances where it can have a beneficial help, but it's not going to save us, and we shouldn't want to be saved. Could other methods be used? So I think that's the idea that, like, well, if we want to make progress, could we still do it without genetic modification? I mean, sure, people do that all the time, like crop breeders. So like crop breeders, farmers, I mean, they're doing genetic modification. They're just doing it the old way. They're breeding crops, selecting through natural selection, or I guess artificial selection, the things that they want. And they're doing genetic modification. So you could do it through traditional crop breeding. It's just going to be slower. And maybe that's actually better. Like, maybe that is better. There's pluses and minuses. What else could you do? I do think, so and I talk about this as well in the heuristics lecture. I do strongly think that we always try to build, it's a flaw of logic. We always try to build these complex solutions. Like, the example I give is, we want to cure malaria. So let's design a genetically modified symbiont that goes inside of a mosquito that kills a malaria parasite when it's in the midgut. And let's release these mosquitoes and release a symbiont. And in one sense, that's cool. In the other sense, it's like, no, let's put windows on people's, let's give people glass windows or screens, and let's close people's doors at night and let them sleep under a bed net. And it's like, that's going to do more for curing malaria than genetic modification. So where we can, here's the final answer. Where we can, use simple solutions first. And I do have a research project on a very simple solution, which I'm very fond of, that I can't reveal right now. Where we can, use simple solutions first. That's my final answer. What would you say is the greatest contribution genetic modification made to our society? That's an interesting question. I mean, this depends on, like, okay, if we're talking about like traditional, like breeding, probably like domestications of beer yeast. Like, that's a good thing. Okay, let's give a real answer. Genetic modification made to society. I mean, I'm an entomologist. This is not a genetic modification. I was going to say sterile insect technique, but that's not a genetic modification. I would say, like, riddle, it's release of insects with a dominant lethal. That seems to be working. That's working. It's an implementation of the sterile insect technique with genetic modification. It's killing mosquitoes. That's what you're seeing in the Florida Keys. That's at least preventing people in the Florida Keys from getting dengue. That's kind of something that's real. What would you say is the greatest? I mean, the other big one, okay, more big than riddle, would be the golden rice. Golden rice is when they take the rice and they engineer it with the beta carotene pathway. And so now essentially you just have the same rice, except that it makes vitamins for people. That's like a big thing. That's probably like that's preventing people from starving. I'm trying to think of, like, has any like disease been cured with genetic modification, like vaccines. So many vaccines are, you take the organism and you genetically modify it somehow, or you clone out one of its genes, you make recombinant like protein that then you inject as a antigen. So vaccines, many are developed with genetic modification. So yes, vaccines. Those are some good examples. I can move on. There's more. Do you have any comments about the human twins supposedly genetically? Supposedly they were genetically modified in China. I actually, yeah, I mean, I made videos on this. They're on my YouTube in one of the musings playlists. I have whole videos talking about this genetic modification of humans. Essentially, one of the things, like when that happened, the Russians literally came out and said, it was reported in either Nature or Science magazine. There was an interview with a researcher, and the researcher literally said, if the Chinese are doing it, we're going to do it too. So like, as soon as that happened, I would say like the cat was out of the bag. And that's what I'm saying about how like, it doesn't matter what the ethics of America determines, like that's not going to set the ethics of the planet. People are going to do whatever they want to do. My other comment, when if I remember correctly from that commentary, the other thing that I thought was, it's only going to happen more. So I'm just thinking like strictly logically, like what's going to happen? It's going to happen more and more and more. It's not going to happen less. It's going to happen more and more and more. It's not going to happen less. And what you worry about, here's what you worry about. When you start to make genetic modifications and people start artificially selecting for what they prefer, you end up picking things you don't want behind the scenes. And you end up losing loss of genetic diversity. That's the issue with the crops, the BT crops. Like another one I could write here is BT corn. BT corn, which like kills insects that eat it. My kids are fighting. The reason I'm always I'm a fan of the BT stuff. The reason we have to be careful about it is because what happens is these companies, they make a strain that works so well that nobody wants anything else. It's like the iPad, or the iPhone. Everybody it has good enough competitors now, but the issue with monopolies is there's no diversity. There's a complete loss of genetic diversity. So if you just have one strain of corn that is BT that everybody wants and everybody uses, now all of a sudden you're not growing, you don't have genetic diversity in your corn crops. And if anything comes along that can kill that strain, your entire crop of corn is going to be completely wiped out. I talk about that in the heuristics lecture. You want to maintain genetic diversity. So if you extrapolate that into humanity, like what's going to happen? Genetic modification of humans is only going to happen more and more and more. It might not become common for the next 300 years, but it's only going to happen more and more and more. And eventually, I think it might be common. And what you worry about then is you worry about situations where you lose genetic diversity in the human population. And that's going to set us up for things like inbreeding, extinction, and we might not even realize it's happening as it's happening. Will you be teaching Applied Biotechnology 1 next semester? Yes. APBT 3100. Take it. Good class. Anything else I need to say? Hopefully that answers all your questions. And